Grandma, you're basically a charity case. I didn't react right away. Not because it didn't matter, but because I was trying to understand why it did. The words landed clean and loud across the table. For a second, I thought I'd misheard her. The restaurant had been full, low music, soft laughter, the clink of glasses, but in that moment, everything seemed to drop into a strange, hollow silence. Chloe sat across from me, her small hands folded neatly beside her plate, her expression almost casual, like she had just said something ordinary, like she hadn't just stripped me down to something small and disposable in front of a room full of strangers. No one spoke. A couple at the next table paused mid-conversation. I noticed it without looking directly, just a shift in the air the way attention quietly turned toward us. I felt my fingers tighten slightly around the edge of my napkin. Marcus let out a short laugh. Not shocked. Not angry. Just amused. "Chloe," he said lightly, not even looking at me, "that's not how we say things. Not how we say things. Not, that's not true. Not, that's disrespectful. Not, don't talk to her like that." Danielle didn't correct her either. She reached for her wine eyes, flicking briefly toward me, then away again like she was waiting to see how I'd react before deciding which side of the moment she wanted to stand on. Chloe tilted her head, but Mom had already said it. Danielle cut in quickly this time, a little sharper but still controlled. "Eat your food." And just like that, it was supposed to be over, like it hadn't happened, like I hadn't just been reduced to a line item in their private conversations, something discussed, defined, and dismissed when I wasn't in the room. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't push back. I just sat there. Because the worst part wasn't the words themselves. It was how easily they had come out of her. Children don't invent things like that. They repeat what they hear. They absorb what's said behind closed doors and carry it into the open without understanding the weight of it, which meant this wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a slip. It was something that had been said before enough times to become normal. I slowly placed my napkin on the table. "I think I'm going to step outside for a moment," I said. My voice sounded steady, even to me. Marcus finally looked at me then, like he was just now remembering I was part of the evening. "Mom, come on, she's just a kid." "Just a kid." I nodded once. Exactly. I stood smoothing my jacket like everything about this night was still intact, still respectable, still under control. No one tried to stop me. Not really. Danielle gave me a polite, almost automatic smile. Marcus had already picked up his phone. Chloe went back to her plate as if nothing important had happened at all, and that might have been the clearest answer of all. I walked past the tables, past the quiet glances that followed me without being obvious, past the waiter who hesitated like he wasn't sure if he should say something. The door opened and the cool night air hit my face. For a moment I just stood there, breathing, letting the noise of the restaurant fade behind me. "My name is Cynthia Redford. I'm 67 years old, and I spent most of my life believing that if you gave your family everything, your time, your effort, your support, they would at the very least see you clearly, not as an obligation, not as a convenience, and certainly not as a charity case." I leaned lightly against the railing outside the restaurant, watching the traffic move past in slow, steady lines. Headlights, red lights, movement that didn't pause just because something inside me had shifted. Because something had. Not all at once, but enough. If you've ever been in a moment where you realize you've been seen the wrong way for a long time, you might understand this feeling. And if you want to see how this story unfolds, make sure you're subscribed and tell me where you're watching from. I stayed outside a little longer than I needed to, long enough to decide that going back in wouldn't fix anything, long enough to understand that whatever had just happened at that table wasn't new. It was just the first time I'd heard it out loud, and for the first time in a very long time I didn't feel confused. I felt clear, quietly, painfully clear. I turned, walked to my car, and didn't look back, because something in me had already stepped away from that table long before I did. I drove home in silence, not the peaceful kind, the kind that presses in on you, fills the space, makes every small thought sound louder than it should. The streets were still busy, headlights sliding past in steady lines, but I barely noticed them. My mind kept circling back to the same moment over and over again, Grandma, you're basically a charity case. It wasn't just what Chloe had said, it was how easily it had been said, and more than that, how no one at that table had truly corrected her. Marcus hadn't been shocked, Danielle hadn't been offended. Neither of them had looked at me like something unfair had just happened. They had reacted like it was inconvenient, like something slightly embarrassing had been said out loud that should have stayed private. I pulled into my driveway and sat there for a moment, the engine still running. The house looked exactly the same as it always had. Warm lights in the windows, quiet, still. For years I had thought of this place as the center of everything I'd built. Stability, safety, a foundation my family could rely on. Tonight, for the first time, it didn't feel quite as solid. I turned off the engine and went inside. The air was still carrying that faint scent of lavender I'd always liked. Everything was in its place. Nothing had changed, and yet something had. I set my purse down, slipped off my shoes, and walked slowly into the kitchen. Out of habit, I reached for a glass, filled it with water, and took a sip. Even that felt different, like I was moving through routines that belonged to a version of me from a few hours ago. I leaned lightly against the counter, staring at nothing in particular. Children repeat what they hear. That thought came back again clearer this time. Chloe didn't invent that sentence. She didn't understand it, not really. But she had heard it somewhere, more than once, which meant someone had said it, which meant someone had believed it. I let out a slow breath. Charity case. The words didn't sound like something Marcus would come up with on his own. Not exactly. He'd always been softer than that, more indirect. Danielle, on the other hand, had a way of seeing things in terms of value, contribution, appearance, what someone brought to the table, what they were worth. I pushed that thought aside almost immediately. No, I wasn't going to start making assumptions, not yet. But something about tonight refused to settle into a simple explanation. If it had been just one careless comment, it would have felt different. This didn't feel careless. It felt practiced. I picked up my glass again, then set it back down untouched. My eyes drifted toward the hallway, toward the small office I rarely used anymore. The door was slightly open just as I'd left it earlier that week. Inside were folders, old records, financial papers I hadn't had any reason to look at in a long time. For years I had handled things quietly, transfers, support, covering gaps when they came up. It had never felt like a burden. It had felt like family. Marcus needed help starting out. Of course I stepped in. Danielle's boutique struggled, of course I helped stabilize things. Chloe's school tuition, of course I wanted her to have the best opportunities. None of that had ever felt like charity. It had felt like care, support, love expressed in the most practical way I knew how. So where had that line shifted? When had something freely given started being seen as something owed? I straightened slightly, folding my arms without realizing it. And why did Chloe say it so confidently? Not like she was guessing, like she was repeating something she understood at least in tone, if not in meaning. I walked slowly toward the office, stopping just at the doorway. The light inside was dim, the room quiet, untouched. For a moment I considered closing the door and leaving everything exactly as it was, because once you start looking too closely at something you risk seeing things you can't unsee. And I wasn't entirely sure I was ready for that. But the thought didn't leave. It stayed there, steady, persistent. There's a difference between feeling hurt and feeling wrong about something. Hurt can pass. It fades with time, with distance. But that other feeling, the quiet sense that something doesn't add up, that you've missed something important that doesn't go away on its own. It waits. It builds. And tonight it was louder than anything else. I stepped into the room. The floor creaked softly under my weight as I crossed to the desk. My hand hovered briefly over the top drawer before I pulled it open. Inside were neatly stacked folders, organized the way I'd always kept them. Careful, orderly, clear. At least they used to be. I pulled one out at random and set it on the desk. For a second I didn't open it. I just looked at it. Because something about this moment felt different. Like I wasn't just checking records. Like I was about to confirm something I hadn't wanted to question before. I opened the folder, and as my eyes began to scan the first page, a quiet, unsettling thought settled in. Maybe this wasn't just about what Chloe had said. Maybe it was about why it had sounded so certain, and for the first time that night I didn't feel confused. I felt alert, like I had been looking at the same picture for years, and had only just realized there might be something missing from it. I pulled the folder a little closer under the light. The paper felt familiar beneath my fingers. Smooth, slightly worn at the edges from years of being handled, reviewed, filed away again. This was something I had always been good at. Keeping things in order. Making sure nothing slipped through unnoticed. For a long time, that had been enough. I let my eyes settle on the first page. A transfer. Nothing unusual about that. I had made hundreds over the years. Some small, some not. Always for a reason. Always with purpose. I turned the page. Another transfer. Larger this time. I frowned slightly, not because the number was shocking, but because I didn't immediately remember it. That more than anything caught my attention. I had always known where my money went, or at least I thought I did. I flipped to the next page, and then the next. The pattern didn't take long to appear. Regular deposits, consistent timing, amounts that weren't random, they were structured, planned. I went back over the numbers again, slower this time just to be sure I wasn't reading something into it that wasn't there, almost expected. I straightened a little, the quiet in the room suddenly feeling different. This wasn't occasional help, this was something else. I reached for another folder, pulling it free with a little more urgency than before. The tabs were labeled by year, neatly arranged exactly the way I'd left them. Nothing had changed, which meant this had been there all along. I opened the second folder and scanned quickly, my eyes moving faster now, connecting numbers instead of reading them one by one. Transfers to Marcus, covering shortfalls, credit card payments, mortgage assistance, school tuition, business support. It wasn't one category. It was everything. A slow breath left my chest, but I barely noticed it, because the realization wasn't coming all at once. It was building, line by line, entry by entry, until it became impossible to ignore. I moved to the next year, then another, the same pattern repeated, not occasionally, not during emergencies, consistently, quietly, reliably, like something they had come to depend on. I leaned back slightly, one hand resting against the edge of the desk. For a moment, I tried to frame it the way I always had. Support, family, helping when it was needed, but the numbers didn't feel like that anymore. They felt systematic. I picked up one of the statements again this time, more slowly, forcing myself to read every line instead of skimming. There were notes in the margins. My own handwriting, temporary, just this month, until things stabilize. I stared at those words longer than I should have, because they were all still here, month after month, year after year. Nothing had stabilized. It had simply continued. I closed the folder halfway, then opened it again. As if the numbers might rearrange themselves if I gave them enough time. They didn't. They stayed exactly where they were. Clear, uncomplicated, uncomfortable. I reached for a calculator, then stopped. I didn't need it. Not really. The exact total didn't matter yet. What mattered was the pattern, and the pattern was undeniable. There's a moment when something shifts from being a feeling to being a fact. It doesn't happen loudly. There's no clear line. Just a quiet point where you realize you're no longer guessing. You're seeing. And what I was seeing didn't match what I had believed for years. This wasn't support that had been asked for occasionally. This wasn't help given during difficult times. This was a system, one that had been running for far longer than I had allowed myself to notice. I opened another folder, different documents this time, bank statements tied to joint accounts records I hadn't reviewed closely in a while because there had never seemed to be a reason. I scanned the transactions, then slowed, then stopped. Because there it was again, the same structure, the same flow, money moving in one direction, predictably, repeatedly, toward them. I felt something tighten in my chest, not sharp, not sudden, but steady, like a realization settling into place. They hadn't been adjusting to what I gave. They had been building around it, planning around it, depending on it, and somewhere along the way it had stopped being something I offered and started being something they expected. I set the paper down carefully, too carefully, as if any sudden movement might break something that had already been fragile for longer than I'd realized, because this wasn't about one payment, or even a series of them. It was about what those payments had become, what they represented. I looked down at my own handwriting again. Just until things get better. A small, almost unnoticeable exhale left me. Things hadn't gotten better. They had simply been maintained. By me. For them. For years. I leaned back in my chair, the room around me still and quiet, exactly as it had been when I first walked in. Nothing had changed out there, but here everything had. Because for the first time I wasn't looking at these numbers as choices I had made. I was looking at them as a structure I had created, one that had quietly shaped the way my family saw me, and perhaps more importantly, what they believed they could take for granted. I closed the folder, not abruptly, just deliberately, because I didn't need to look any further to understand what I was dealing with. And as that understanding settled in, one thing became clear in a way it never had before. This wasn't just help. It hadn't been for a very long time. I had been carrying something much larger than I had ever intended, and calling it love. And now that I could finally see it for what it was, I knew I couldn't go back to not seeing it. Not anymore. I didn't open another folder. I didn't need to. The pattern was already clear, and whatever came after this wouldn't change what I had just seen. It would only add to it. Slowly, I placed the folder back on the desk and aligned it with the others the way I always did. Careful. Precise. But this time, it didn't feel like control. It felt like acknowledgement. I rested my hands lightly on the edge of the desk, staring at the rows of files in front of me. For years, I had believed I was helping them stay afloat. What I hadn't realized was that I had become the water they were floating on. And once something like that settles into place, it doesn't correct itself. It grows. Quietly. Until it becomes normal. I exhaled slowly and stepped back from the desk. If this was a system, then it had to be understood like one. Not emotionally, not impulsively, clearly. I turned off the desk lamp and walked into the kitchen, reaching for my phone. The screen lit up immediately, casting a soft glow across the room. Everything felt still. Too still. I opened my banking app. The familiar interface appeared clean and simple, exactly as it always had. For years I had moved through these screens without hesitation, checking balances, confirming transfers, making decisions quickly, and without second-guessing. Tonight I moved more slowly. Deliberately, I tapped into the main account first. The balance was steady, stable, enough to support anything I might reasonably need. That part hadn't changed, but stability, I was beginning to understand, could be misleading. I opened the transaction history. At first it looked ordinary: groceries, utilities, small predictable expenses. Then the transfers appeared, regular, consistent, almost quiet in the way they blended into everything else. I scrolled further, the same names, the same patterns. Amounts that weren't accidental, they were structured. I tapped into one of the transfers, opening the details. Recipient, Marcus Redford. The date lined up perfectly with the pattern I had just seen in the folders. I went back and opened another, and another, the same. Not requests, not emergencies, just continuations. I shifted slightly, leaning against the counter as I navigated deeper into the accounts. There were other connections too. Linked accounts. Joint access points. I hadn't thought about in a long time because there had never seemed to be a reason to question them. I opened one. For a moment I hesitated. Then I tapped. The screen refreshed. And there it was again. Activity that matched what I had seen on paper. Except now it felt more immediate, more real. Because this wasn't history anymore. This was active. Ongoing. I pressed my lips together, focusing. There were automatic payments set up. Tuition insurance, recurring expenses tied to their household. Some were familiar, others less so. I didn't remember setting all of these, or maybe I had. Maybe I had simply done it without marking the moment as important. That thought lingered longer than I expected, because it suggested something I hadn't wanted to consider before, that this hadn't happened all at once. It had been built, decision by decision, adjustment by adjustment, each one reasonable on its own, until the sum of them became something else entirely. I straightened and walked slowly to the dining table, setting my phone down for a moment. The house was quiet around me, the kind of quiet that doesn't offer comfort, only space. Space to think. Space to see. I pulled out a chair and sat down, folding my hands loosely in front of me. If I continued like this, just observing, just confirming, I would keep learning more, but nothing would actually change. And that was the problem. Because now that I understood what this was leaving it untouched wasn't neutral, it was a decision. I picked up my phone again. This time I didn't open the transaction history. I went to the settings, access controls, permissions, things I hadn't reviewed in years, not because I couldn't, because I had trusted that I didn't need to. The list appeared, names, connections, authorizations. Some of them made immediate sense. Others required a second look. I felt a small, steady shift inside me, not sudden, not emotional, just focused. For the first time that night, I wasn't reacting to what had already happened. I was looking at what could happen next, and what I was willing to allow. My thumb hovered briefly over the screen. There were options here, simple ones, small changes that could alter the entire structure I had just uncovered. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough. Enough to interrupt the pattern. Enough to test something I hadn't questioned before. I lowered my hand slightly, not tapping anything yet, not making a move, because this wasn't just about action. It was about understanding exactly what that action would mean. For them, for me, for everything that had been built on top of this quiet, invisible system. I set the phone down again, letting the screen dim. The room felt different now. Not heavier, just clearer, like the shape of something had finally come into focus. I wasn't unsure anymore. I wasn't guessing. I knew what this was. And more importantly, I knew it couldn't continue the way it had. Not after tonight. Not after seeing it this clearly. I leaned back slightly in the chair, my gaze drifting toward the hallway again. The office door was still open, the folders still inside. Nothing had changed there. But something had changed here. Because for the first time I wasn't thinking about what I had given. I was thinking about what I was still giving. Right now, in ways that were still active, still running, still expected. And as that thought settled in, I understood something else just as clearly. The next step wouldn't be complicated, but it would be deliberate. And once I took it, there wouldn't be a way to pretend I hadn't seen all of this. Not anymore. I didn't sleep much that night, not because my mind was racing, but because it wasn't. Everything had settled into a kind of quiet clarity that didn't leave much room for rest. There were no more questions to circle, no more possibilities to weigh against each other, only decisions. By morning, the house was still as I left it, the same light through the windows, the same silence in the hallway. Nothing on the outside had shifted, but I had. I moved through my routine slowly, deliberately. Coffee. A piece of toast I barely touched. The small, familiar steps that gave structure to a day that no longer felt ordinary. There was no urgency in what I was about to do. That was the strange part. Because urgency suggests panic. And this wasn't panic. This was correction. I set my cup in the sink and picked up my purse, checking once to make sure everything I needed was there. Wallet, phone, a small folder I had pulled from the office before going to bed, just in case. The drive to the bank was uneventful. Traffic moved steadily, the city settling into its usual rhythm. People heading to work, shops opening, life continuing exactly as it always did. It struck me briefly how little the outside world reflects what's happening underneath it. How something significant can shift completely quietly and no one beyond it ever notices. I parked a short distance from the entrance and sat for a moment before stepping out. Not hesitating, just acknowledging. Then I opened the door and walked inside. The bank was calm, the low murmur of voices blending with the soft hum of computers and the occasional sound of papers being moved across a desk. It was a place I knew well. For years I had walked in and out of here with ease, familiar faces, familiar processes, predictable, safe. Daniel Brooks looked up from behind the counter as I approached. His expression warmed with recognition almost immediately. "Mrs. Redford," he said, stepping forward slightly. "Good morning. It's been a while." "It has," I replied, offering a small, polite smile. He gestured toward a quieter area. "Would you like to sit down?" I nodded. We moved to a small office just off the main floor, the glass walls giving a sense of openness without sacrificing privacy. He closed the door behind us and took a seat across from me. "What can I help you with today?" he asked. There was no suspicion in his voice, no expectation of anything unusual, just routine. I placed my purse on the chair beside me and set the folder on the desk between us. "I'd like to review some account access and make a few adjustments," I said. He nodded immediately, turning slightly toward his computer. "Of course. Which accounts are we looking at, all of them?" I replied. That made him pause, not dramatically, just enough to register. "All right," he said. After a second, his tone still professional. "We can go through them, one by one." He began pulling up the primary account first, the same one I had looked at the night before. Numbers appeared on the screen. Familiar, stable, untouched. For clarity, he added, "Are you looking to update beneficiaries or access?" I said gently. "Permissions. Linked accounts." He glanced at me again more directly this time. Understood. The next few minutes passed quietly as he navigated through the system. Names appeared. Connections I recognized. Others I hadn't thought about in years. "Currently," he said, angling the screen slightly, "your son has viewing access here and limited authorization on transfers up to a certain amount." I nodded. "And these," he continued, scrolling, "are the automatic payments tied to the account." There they were. Exactly as I had seen them the night before. Structured, consistent, expected. "I'd like to remove that access," I said. He didn't question it. Not in the way someone might outside of this room. Inside, a bank control is assumed. Ownership is clear. "If you're certain," he said, his fingers already moving toward the appropriate fields. "I am." He clicked once, then again. Small sounds. Quiet. But definitive. "Access removed," he said. Something in my chest shifted, not sharply, just enough. "Next," I said. We moved through each account the same way. Linked profiles, permissions, automatic transfers, each one identified, each one addressed, each one changed. At one point he paused again. "Some of these payments are scheduled to process later this week. Would you like to cancel those as well?" I met his gaze briefly. "Yes." No explanation, no hesitation. He nodded and made the adjustments. The system responded immediately. Confirmed, updated, closed. The room remained quiet except for the soft tapping of keys and the occasional confirmation tone from his computer. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud, but with each change something invisible shifted. Not just numbers on a screen, structure, expectation, dependency. "Is there anything else?" he asked once we had gone through the final account. I glanced at the screen one last time. Clean, simplified, contained. "No," I said, "that's all." He turned back toward me, offering a polite, reassuring smile. "Everything has been updated. If you need anything further, don't hesitate to reach out." "I won't," I replied. I gathered my things, slowly standing without hurry. There was no rush now, no urgency left in this moment, because the part that required decision had already passed. I thanked him, stepped out of the office, and walked through the main floor of the bank with the same steady pace I had entered with. Nothing about me looked different. No one watching would have known that anything had changed, but something had. Completely. I stepped outside into the late morning light, the air cooler than I expected. For a moment, I simply stood there, not thinking, not questioning, just aware. Because for the first time in a very long time, the system I had been supporting was no longer running on its own, and whatever happened next wouldn't happen automatically. Marcus didn't notice anything at first. That was the part I expected. Systems like the one I had just interrupted don't collapse immediately. They don't announce themselves. They keep moving forward on momentum, carrying the people inside them a little further before the absence begins to register. By late morning, he was still moving through his day exactly as he always did, confident, certain, unaware. I knew where he would be, not because I had checked, because he had mentioned it the night before. Casually, almost proudly, while Danielle scrolled through her phone and Chloe picked at her food. Big meeting tomorrow, he had said, might finally close the deal. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it. Now it felt relevant. I didn't call. I didn't text. There was nothing to say. Whatever was going to happen next didn't require my presence to begin, only my absence. The showroom was bright that afternoon. Glass walls, polished floors, the kind of space designed to reflect success back at the people walking through it. Marcus stood near the center, one hand resting lightly against the hood of a dark SUV, his posture relaxed in the way that comes from believing everything is already within reach. Kevin Park stood across from him, tablet in hand, his tone smooth and practiced. "So once we finalize this, you'll be all set," Kevin was saying. "We just need to process the payment and we can have everything ready by the end of the day." Marcus nodded, a small smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "Let's do it," he said. Danielle stood a few steps away, arms loosely folded, her expression carefully composed. There was satisfaction there, but also expectation. The kind that had grown comfortable over time. "This one feels right," she added, glancing at Marcus. "It's about time." Marcus let out a quiet chuckle. "Yeah, it is." He reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone, tapping the screen with the easy familiarity of someone who had done this many times before. Across the showroom, another customer laughed softly with a salesperson. Somewhere behind them, a printer hummed to life. Everything moved as it should, normal, seamless. Kevin turned the tablet toward Marcus. "If you could just confirm the transfer here, we'll take care of the rest." Marcus leaned slightly closer, scanning the screen. "No problem." He didn't hesitate. Why would he? From his perspective, nothing had changed. The account was stable. The transfers always went through. The system worked. Danielle stepped closer, her voice low but clear. "Let's just get it done." Marcus nodded again, tapping through the prompts. His movements were quick, confident, almost automatic. For a second, he still looked like he believed this could be fixed, like this was just another problem he could talk his way out of. There's a certain kind of certainty that comes from repetition. When something works the same way over and over again, you stop checking, you stop questioning, you assume the outcome before it happens. And that assumption becomes its own kind of blindness. Kevin watched the screen, waiting for confirmation. Marcus shifted his weight slightly, one hand resting on the counter, now his attention fixed on the process. "Just a second," Kevin said, glancing down as the system began to process. Marcus exhaled lightly, not impatient, just used to the brief pause. Behind him, Danielle glanced around the showroom again, taking in the space as if it already belonged to them. "This is going to look good," she said quietly. Marcus didn't answer right away. His focus stayed on the screen. Processing. That word appeared briefly, then disappeared. Kevin frowned slightly, almost imperceptibly, as he tapped once more. "Let me just—" He began adjusting something on the tablet. Marcus didn't react. Not yet, because there was no reason to. Moments like this had always resolved themselves. Always. I didn't need to be there to see what was happening. I could picture it clearly. The pause, the small adjustment, the assumption that it would correct itself, because it always had. Until now. Back at home, I sat at the dining table, the same place I had been earlier, my phone resting face down in front of me. I hadn't checked it. I didn't need to. The outcome wasn't uncertain. Only the moment it would become visible. There's a difference between stopping something and seeing what happens after it stops. The first is a decision. The second is a consequence, and consequences don't arrive all at once. They unfold slowly, at first almost quietly, then all at once. I leaned back slightly in my chair, my gaze drifting toward the window. Outside, the afternoon light had shifted, casting longer shadows across the yard. Time was moving, whether anyone noticed or not. In the showroom, Kevin tapped the screen again, his expression tightening just a fraction more. "Give me one moment," he said. Marcus let out a small breath through his nose, still relaxed. "Sure." Danielle's eyes flicked briefly between them. Something had changed. Not enough to name, but enough to feel. Marcus straightened slightly, his hand lowering from the counter. "What's going on?" he asked, not concerned. "Just curious." Kevin didn't answer immediately. He was looking at the screen now more closely than before. Scrolling, checking, verifying. The confidence in the room hadn't disappeared. Not yet. But it had shifted. Subtly. Just enough to create a space where something unexpected could exist. And for the first time that afternoon, Marcus wasn't entirely certain what would happen next. Kevin didn't speak right away. He kept his eyes on the screen, scrolling once more slower this time, as if the answer might appear differently if he gave it enough attention. Marcus shifted his weight, not impatient, just waiting. "What's going on?" he asked again, this time with a trace of firmness beneath the calm. Kevin glanced up briefly, then back down. "It's just taking a little longer than usual," he said. "Let me run it again." Marcus nodded. "Sure." He didn't look concerned, not yet. Danielle, however, had stopped scanning the showroom. Her focus had narrowed, settling on Kevin's hands on the tablet, on the small delay that had begun to stretch just a little too far. Kevin tapped the screen again. Processing. The word appeared, held, then disappeared. He exhaled quietly and adjusted something. "I'm just going to verify a few details," he said. Marcus let out a short breath, half a laugh. "That's never a good sign." Kevin didn't respond to that. Instead, he tapped again, and this time he stopped. There was no immediate explanation, no smooth transition into the next step, just a stillness that hadn't been there before. Marcus noticed it. What he asked. Kevin looked up, and for the first time there was something different in his expression. Not confusion, not even concern. Clarity. "I'm getting a decline," he said. The word didn't land all at once. It sat there, suspended between them, almost too simple to register. Marcus blinked. "That doesn't make sense." Kevin nodded slightly already, tapping again. "Let me try once more." Danielle stepped closer now, her voice low. "Is there a problem?" "It might just be a temporary hold," Kevin said, though his tone had lost some of its earlier ease. "I'm checking." Marcus straightened his hand, returning to the counter. "Run it again," he said. Kevin did. The tablet refreshed, processing, a pause, then the same result. He didn't need to say it this time. Marcus saw it in his face. "No," Marcus said quietly, shaking his head once. "That's not right." He pulled his phone back up, tapping quickly, his movements no longer as relaxed as they had been moments before. "There's plenty in the account," he added, more to himself than anyone else. Danielle's arms dropped to her sides. "Marcus!" "Hold on," he said sharply, not looking at her. Kevin remained still, giving him space, but his posture had shifted, more formal now, more cautious. Around them, the showroom continued as it had before, but not entirely. A salesperson across the floor glanced over briefly, then looked away. Another paused mid-sentence with a customer just for a second too long. Small things, subtle, but noticeable. Marcus tapped again, his brow tightening. "It's not even showing a transfer," he said. "That's impossible." Kevin cleared his throat softly. If the authorization isn't going through, it could be related to account permissions or— "That's not it," Marcus cut in. "I've done this 100 times. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried just enough. Danielle shifted her weight, her gaze flicking briefly around the room before returning to him. "Maybe we should." "No," Marcus said again, sharper now. "Just give it a second." Kevin didn't argue. He simply waited. The silence stretched. Not empty, not neutral. Tight, like something pulling just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment it would finally break. A man near the entrance slowed his step as he passed, his eyes lingering for a fraction longer than necessary. The woman he was with leaned in slightly, whispering something Marcus couldn't hear, but he saw the glance that followed. Not curiosity, recognition. Something was off. And it was no longer contained to just the three of them. Kevin tapped once more, slower, now deliberate. The system responded immediately this time. No delay, no processing, just the result. He looked up. "I'm sorry," he said. The words were quieter than before. "Careful. But the transaction isn't authorized. The account isn't allowing this payment." Marcus stared at him. For a second, nothing moved. Then he let out a short, disbelieving breath. "That's not possible. It's what I'm seeing," Kevin replied. Danielle took a small step back. Not dramatic, just instinctive. Like something in the room had shifted in a way she didn't want to be too close to. Marcus looked down at his phone again, then back up. "Call someone," he said. "There's got to be a mistake." Kevin hesitated. "We can contact the bank, but—" "Do it," Marcus said. His voice was still controlled, but the certainty that had been there earlier was gone, replaced with something thinner, more fragile. Kevin nodded and turned slightly, already reaching for his phone. Marcus stood there, shoulders squared, eyes fixed ahead, as if holding himself in place might somehow hold everything else together. Danielle didn't speak. Not this time. Because there was nothing left to soften, nothing left to reframe, only the reality of what was happening. Quiet, visible, and no longer avoidable. And for the first time, Marcus wasn't standing in control of the moment. He was standing inside it. If you were in that showroom watching everything unfold in real time, what would you think? Would you say something or just look away? Tell me what you would do, and don't forget to like this video if moments like this make you think twice about what people take for granted. Marcus finally lowered his phone. His gaze drifted briefly across the room, catching one or two of the looks that hadn't quite managed to hide in time. Then back to Kevin. Then to the tablet. And in that quiet sequence of movements, something shifted completely. Because this wasn't a delay anymore, it wasn't a technical issue, it wasn't something that would resolve itself with another attempt. It was a stop. Clean. Final. And everyone in that small, carefully controlled space could feel it. Even before anyone said it out loud. Even before Marcus fully accepted it. The system he had trusted was no longer there to catch him. Kevin stepped away to make the call. Not quickly. Not urgently. Just professionally. That was the part that seemed to unsettle Marcus the most, because nothing about this felt like an emergency to anyone else. Only to him. He stood there, phone still in his hand, staring at the blank screen as if it might change if he waited long enough. It didn't. Danielle didn't move closer this time. She stayed where she was, a few steps back, her arms loosely folded again. But this time, not out of comfort. Out of distance. Marcus glanced at her. "It's just a hold," he said, forcing a small, tight smile. "They do this sometimes." She didn't respond right away. Her eyes flicked toward Kevin, then back to Marcus. "Do they?" she asked quietly. The question wasn't confrontational, but it wasn't supportive either. Marcus let out a short breath. "Yeah. It's happened before." It hadn't. Not like this. But he said it anyway, because saying it made the moment feel smaller, more manageable. Danielle shifted her weight slightly, her posture straightening. "Then why doesn't he look like that's what it is?" she asked, her voice still low, still controlled. Marcus didn't answer, because he had already seen it. Kevin's expression. Careful, measured, certain. The kind of certainty you don't argue with. Kevin returned a moment later, phone still in his hand. "I spoke with the bank," he said. Marcus straightened immediately, and there was a brief pause. Not long. Just enough. "They've confirmed that the account permissions have been updated," Kevin said. "The authorization for this transaction is no longer available." The words were clear, simple, final. Marcus stared at him. "What does that mean?" he asked. Kevin held his gaze. It means the account can't be used for this purchase. Danielle's arms dropped slowly to her sides. Marcus shook his head once sharper this time. No, that's not right. There's money in that account. I'm not disputing that, Kevin replied, but the access required to complete this transaction isn't active anymore. By who? Marcus asked, his voice rising just slightly. Who changed it? Kevin hesitated, not because he didn't know, but because the answer was obvious. Marcus followed that hesitation, and in that split second, he understood. No, he said under his breath. Danielle's gaze sharpened. What Marcus didn't look at her. He was already dialing. The phone pressed hard against his ear, his jaw tightening as he waited. It rang once, twice, then went to voicemail. He pulled it away, stared at the screen, then tried again. Same result. Danielle watched him this time, not hiding it. "Who are you calling?" she asked. Marcus didn't answer. He didn't need to. Her expression shifted anyway. Not confusion, recognition, something clicking into place. "Marcus," she said slowly, "what did you set up?" He exhaled sharply. "Nothing. It's just something got flagged, I'll fix it." But his voice had changed. The confidence was gone, replaced with something thinner, more urgent. Danielle took a small step back, then another. Not dramatic, not obvious, but enough. "You said everything was handled," she said, her tone tightening. "You said we were fine." "We are?" Marcus snapped too quickly. "Just give me a second." Kevin remained where he was, silent now, no longer part of the conversation, because this wasn't about the transaction anymore, it was about what had been behind it. Danielle's eyes moved over Marcus's face, searching, measuring, recalculating. "You didn't actually have control over that account, did you?" she asked. The question landed harder than anything Kevin had said. Marcus's silence answered it before he could. Danielle let out a slow breath. Not surprised, not exactly. "Just adjusting." "I thought you said it was yours," she continued. "It is," Marcus said quickly. "I mean, it was. It's just..." "Marcus." His name stopped him, cleanly. She shook her head once, a small movement, but final. "You didn't tell me the whole story." "I told you enough," he shot back, his voice rising again. "This doesn't change anything." But it did. They both knew it. Because what had just happened wasn't a technical issue. It was exposure. A line drawn clearly where it had been blurred before. Danielle glanced around the showroom again, more aware now of the space of the people of the way. Attention had quietly shifted toward them. This wasn't private anymore, and whatever they had been presenting was starting to come apart. "I don't do unstable," she said almost to herself. Marcus blinked. "What?" She looked back at him, her expression composed again, but different, colder, measured. "This isn't what you said it was," she added. "It's a delay," Marcus insisted. "That's all." "No," she said. "It's not." There was no anger in her voice, which made it worse. "I need to think," she continued, already reaching for her bag. "Danielle, not here," she said, cutting him off. "Not like this." She turned before he could respond, her heels echoing softly against the polished floor as she walked toward the exit. She didn't look back, not once. Marcus stood there watching her go, his hand still wrapped around his phone. For a moment he didn't move, didn't speak, didn't react. Then something in him snapped, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough. He turned back toward Kevin, his composure slipping. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice sharper now, louder than before. "You're telling me I can't access my own money?" Kevin remained calm. "I'm telling you what the system is showing." "Then your system is wrong," Marcus snapped. "It isn't," Kevin replied just as evenly. That was it. That was the moment. The last piece of control Marcus had been holding on to. Slipped. "Call them again," he said louder now. "Get someone on the line who actually knows what they're doing." Kevin didn't move. "I've already confirmed it," he said. Marcus let out a harsh laugh, running a hand through his hair. "No, you haven't," he said. "You think you have, but you haven't." His voice carried now, no longer contained. Heads turned again. This time not subtly. Marcus didn't notice. Or if he did, he didn't care. Because the situation wasn't something he could smooth over anymore. Not with confidence, not with repetition, not with the system he had relied on, because that system was gone. And without it, there was nothing left to hold him in place. Marcus didn't go home right away, not because he didn't know where to go, but because he wasn't ready to face what would be waiting for him there. He sat in his car for a long time after leaving the dealership, the engine off, the silence pressing in from all sides. His phone rested in his hand, the screen dark, now the calls unanswered. Everything that had happened inside the showroom replayed in fragments. Kevin's voice. Danielle walking away. The looks. That quiet shift in the room when something invisible became visible. He exhaled sharply and leaned his head back against the seat. "It's just a mistake," he muttered under his breath. But the words didn't land the way they had before. They didn't settle. Because somewhere beneath the surface he already knew. It wasn't a mistake. It was a change. And not one he had made. By the time he finally drove back, the sun had already started to drop. The house looked the same as always. Clean. Still. Unmoved. For a moment he sat in the driveway staring at it. Then he stepped out and walked up to the front door, his movements slower now, heavier. He reached for the handle. Locked. He frowned slightly and tried again. Still locked. That wasn't unusual. Except when he reached into his pocket, the key he pulled out didn't fit. He paused, looked at it, then tried again. Nothing. A quiet, sharp breath left his chest. "Seriously," he muttered. He knocked, once, then again harder. "Mom," he called out, "open the door." No answer. The silence inside the house was complete, not empty. Closed. He stepped back slightly, his gaze moving to the windows. No movement, no sign that anyone was inside. His phone was in his hand again before he realized it. He dialed. This time it rang longer, then picked up. "Hello." Cynthia's voice came through, calm and even. "Mom, what's going on?" Marcus said immediately. "The key doesn't work." A brief pause. "I changed the locks," she said. No hesitation, no apology. Marcus blinked. "You what?" "I changed the locks," she repeated. "Why would you do that?" he demanded, his voice rising again. "This is my house." Another pause, short, measured. "No," she said quietly. "It isn't." The words landed harder than anything that had happened earlier that day. "What are you talking about?" Marcus snapped. "I live here." "You stayed here," she corrected. "There's a difference." He let out a disbelieving laugh. "Are you serious right now?" "I am," she replied. There was no anger in her tone, no escalation, just certainty. Marcus ran a hand through his hair, pacing once across the front step. "This is insane," he said. "You can't just lock me out." "I can," she said, "and I have." Silence stretched between them, not loud, not chaotic, just final. "What am I supposed to do?" he asked, the edge in his voice thinning slightly. "That's something you'll need to figure out," she said. The line didn't waver, didn't soften. Marcus stared at the door, at the place he had walked in and out of for years without a second thought. Now, it wasn't his, not in the way he had believed. "Mom," he said again, quieter this time. "You're overreacting." "No," she replied. "I'm correcting something I should have addressed a long time ago." He swallowed his grip, tightening on the phone. "This isn't how you handle things," he said. "It is now." Another pause. Longer this time. Then the call ended. Marcus lowered the phone slowly, staring at the screen as it went dark again. For a moment he didn't move, didn't knock again, didn't call back. Because something in him had shifted, not fully, not cleanly, but enough. Enough to understand that pushing harder wouldn't open that door. Not today. That night he checked into a motel just off the highway. The kind of place you don't look at too closely. Faded paint, dim lighting, a quiet that wasn't peaceful, just empty. The room smelled faintly of cleaning solution and something older underneath it. Marcus set his bag down on the small table and stood there for a moment, taking it in. This wasn't temporary. Not in the way he used to think of things, not just for now. This felt different, because there was no system behind it anymore, no safety net, no quiet structure absorbing the impact. Just this. He sat on the edge of the bed, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the worn carpet. The day replayed again, but this time there was no denial left to hold on to. The account hadn't failed, the access had been removed, the house hadn't been closed for the day, it had been taken back. Danielle hadn't needed time. She had already decided. Everything that had seemed stable hadn't been. It had been supported, maintained, by something he had never fully understood, and now that it was gone, so was everything built on top of it. He let out a slow breath, his shoulders dropping slightly. For the first time, there was no one else to call, no one else to fix it, no one else to step in. Just him. And the consequences of a system he had relied on, without ever questioning why it worked in the first place. There's a difference between losing something and realizing it was never really yours to begin with. Marcus sat there in the quiet room, staring at nothing, the weight of that realization settling in fully now. Not sudden, not dramatic, just complete. Because for the first time in a very long time, there was nothing left to fall back on, and nowhere left to pretend he hadn't seen it. The call came 2 days later. Not from Marcus, but from his lawyer. I recognized the name on the screen and let it ring once before answering, just to give myself a moment to settle. "Mrs. Redford, thank you for taking my call," he said, his tone polite and careful. "You're welcome," I replied. "How can I help you?" There was a brief pause before he spoke again. "My client would like to request a mediation to discuss the current situation and find a way forward that works for both sides." I understood exactly what he meant. "Is he asking for access to the accounts again?" I asked, "or something else?" Another pause followed. "He's asking for a conversation and possibly a temporary arrangement while he stabilizes his situation." I let that word settle. Stabilizes. It was familiar. I had used it myself for years. "All right," I said. "I'll meet with him." We agreed on a time and a small office later that week. The setting was neutral, quiet, and appropriate. Marcus looked different when I saw him again, not in a way that most people would notice, but I knew him well enough to see it. The confidence that used to fill the space around him had thinned. It had not disappeared completely, but it had changed into something more uncertain and more aware. He stood when I walked in. "Mom," he said. I nodded. "Marcus." We sat across from each other, the table between us, clear except for a notepad and a pen. His lawyer remained off to the side, silent and observant. For a moment no one spoke. Then Marcus leaned forward slightly. "I think things got out of hand," he began. I didn't interrupt. "I didn't realize how everything was structured," he continued. "I thought it was just support, not something that could disappear like that." "It didn't disappear," I said calmly. "It was mine to begin with." He exhaled and looked down before meeting my eyes again. "I understand that now. At least I'm starting to." That was the first moment that felt honest. "I'm not asking for everything to go back to the way it was," he said. "I know that's not realistic." "What are you asking for?" I asked. "A chance to fix things, to get back on my feet without everything falling apart at once." There was no anger in his voice, only something quieter and more grounded. "I'm willing to help," I said, "but not the way I did before." He nodded immediately. "Okay. This will be structured and limited," I continued. "You will know exactly what is being provided, and there will be a clear endpoint." He listened without interrupting. "No open access, no automatic payments, no assumptions." He nodded again, slower this time. "That's fair, and the house does not change." His jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't argue. "I understand." We spent the next hour discussing details and boundaries. The conversation stayed practical and focused without unnecessary emotion. When we stood to leave, Marcus hesitated for a moment. "Thank you," he said. I met his eyes. "You're welcome." The words felt different now. Not automatic. Not expected. Life didn't return to what it had been. It couldn't, and I didn't want it to. The house felt quieter in the weeks that followed, not empty, but settled. There were fewer calls, fewer requests, and fewer things that demanded immediate attention. When Marcus did call, he sounded different, more direct, more thoughtful, and less certain. Danielle didn't come back. I heard later that she had moved on quickly and found something that felt more stable to her. That didn't surprise me. Some people are drawn to structure while others are drawn to what supports it. When that support disappears, so do they. I found myself returning to things I had set aside for years. Small routines, quiet moments, and choices that didn't revolve around holding everything together for someone else. The change wasn't dramatic. It was steady, and it felt right. There's a difference between giving out of love and giving in a way that slowly removes your place in your own life. If you were in my position, would you have made the same decision, or would you have let it continue a little longer? Tell me what you think in the comments. If this story made you reflect on your own boundaries, take a moment to like the video. Share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you want more stories like this where quiet decisions change everything, make sure you subscribe. For me, learning to step back was not the end of something. It was the beginning of finally seeing my own place again.